Hi and welcome. In this video, we are looking at creating a balanced model using the Curve Revolve node inside Houdini. I will guide you through some curve basics and show you how we can generate the geometry using the Revolve node. We are also looking at ways to shape, procedurally place wooden blocks at the top and bottom of a model. By the end of this video, you've learned a method to model intricate geometry with a short and simple system. So without further ado, let's get started. So inside Houdini, the first thing we want to do is to create the geometry node. And what I'm going to do is work from a reference image. And to add a reference image inside Houdini, you would want to move your cursor to the viewport, press D. Here you have various options which is displayed inside the viewport. So we want to go to background, go to the front camera. And here we're going to choose a path to the reference image we're going to use. If you don't have a reference image but want to follow along, this is a good spot to pause the video and come back once you have a reference image you have maybe prepared and ready to work with inside Houdini. So once you have chosen your reference image, move the display window to the side, hover back, move the cursor back to your viewport, press the 3 key. This will move you into the front view. So we can zoom out a bit using the scroll wheel, and you can see I have reference image. One thing I want to change before we move on is to move the reference image up so that the lower part of the reference image is on top of this 0 origin. You can do that using the image offset. You have the options to go for the X or Y. I'm going to use the Y to move this up a bit. And just to make things slightly easier to tell where my curve and other geometry and things in the scene is, I'm just going to lower the opacity a bit, about halfway. Let's do 0.5. And now I'm done. I'm just going to close down the display options window. You could choose save as default, but that will also mean that every time you open a new scene, you will have this image as a reference image inside your front display option, and most of the times you would not want that. So we're just going to close the windows. So once we're happy with the placement and the opacity of our reference image, the next step is to create a curve. And I'm going to choose the curve Bezier. This is just a preset of the curve node, allow me to work with Bezier curves. So I'm going to zoom in on my reference image a bit. You're holding down Alt. Alt allows me to navigate while my tool is activated. If your tool isn't activated at this point, move the cursor to the viewport and press Enter. That should activate the curve tool. And you'll know it's activated once you see the hints in the left corner like this. I'm going to start with the draw mode. And it's quite straightforward. Placing a point is done by left click. You can snap to a 45-degree angle by holding down Shift, so you have a straight line. If you want to create a bend, you hold down the left mouse button once when you press down and create a point like this. To delete the point, you go back to the select mode, you drag or click on the point you want to delete and just press delete. Continue where you left off, you'd go back to the draw mode, you click on the point you want to start from. In this case, I'm going to start from the last point, and I should be able to continue and add points. There are various other options we can use. One I like to use is the select mode and clicking and dragging on a segment, which allows me to do these larger bends. And you can also adjust each point's handle by itself. And if you want to create a sharper angle, for example, I don't like this part, I want to be straight, I can select this point, hold down Control, select single handle like this, I can adjust it individually. And I can also move a point with the select mode. And the connection between these two handles are now severed, so these will continue to be moved individually. Those are kind of the basics you need to know about the curve tool for now. So I'm going to finish the baluster or the silhouette, the curve off camera. I'll get back to you in a bit. So once I'm happy with the curve, I'm going to exit by pressing escape. And we're going to move on to the conversion of the curve and prepare it for the revolve nodes. So the first step is the conversion part. So let's do convert. And in the convert node, let's change the from type to Bezier curve. What we'll see now that I have a lot more points and segments on my curve. It's not enough because if you look, there are some segments that are jagged. So we're going to change the resolution a bit by increasing the U option. I know that from testing that 1.5 works really well for me, but it might be different from case to case. So let's play around a bit with that. And then also we're going to remove these extra geometry points because a straight line doesn't need all of these points. So the next step is to add a fasten node. With this, we have an option to remove something called inline points. And this option right here, enable that. And now you should see that our straight lines look a lot cleaner and having less resolution, which means less clutter. That's the cleanup and the preparation. So the next step is actually adding the geometry of our baluster. So let's add revolve. Like so. And straight away, we have some nice looking geometry. Let's move back to perspective using the one button on our numpad. Alternatively, you can go to this option up here and go to set view. Then you can select the viewport you want. You can also see the numbers for each respective viewport. I'm going to turn off the overlay so we don't see those extra points. Our normals right now, the faces or the primitives have flipped normals. I want to flip that. Let's reverse the cross section, choosing this option. We're going to increase the resolution here because these are not really round enough for me. They're still too jagged. So I'm going to go to the divisions, increase that to 32. Now you see it's nice and round. Another thing you can do with Revolve, you can play around a bit with what's something called the open arc option. And what that does is allows you to change this start and end angles. Instead of going from 0 to 360, which is a full circle, you can choose any options like 180, which will give you half of the geometry. It's a good thing maybe for something like a game and things like that, depending on what your needs are. In our case, in my case, sorry, I'm going to keep it to closed arc and flip that back to 360. I want the full 360 degree geometry. We don't need the UV, so I'm going to turn that off, but you have options to play around with that inside the Revolve node. With that, we do have more or less the final baluster or carved part of our geometry done. Next step is to add a bevel. I want to smooth out these sharp edges. You can see here the 90 degree edges. So I'm going to connect that to the poly bevel. I'm going to activate that. And before we start playing around with the distance and the divisions of our bevel, we're going to go to the exclusions and add ignore flat edges. I'm going to enable that, and I'm going to add 60, which means that every change, every move from one surface to another surface that's higher than 60 degrees, and you can see this part right here, this is a 90 degree angle. Everything above 60 will now be affected by the poly bevel, so it will ignore these rounded edges. So if I'm correct now, what we'll see is that this part right here and these angles, which are quite sharp, will now be affected by the poly bevel. So let's start by increasing the distance. And yeah, that works as expected. I'm going to do something along like 0.2. We're going to add some divisions. I'm going to go with 4 because I like what that looks like. With that, we have for the full details. Everything looks great. So now that we have the details on our baluster done, we want to look at a reference image to see what the next step would be. And in this case, I think that is to create the blocks that are on top and the bottom of our model. With that, I'm going to create a box. I'm going to activate it like this. I'm going to zoom in a bit. I'm going to use the handles that you can enable by pressing Enter You can move the segments either direction, up, down, but I'm also going to hold out shift while I do this. And you can see the change happens in mirrors. I'm going to do something like this. And I now know that I want my to be 0.8. I'm going to move this up. I think that's good enough. Plus 1.25. I want that to be 0.82. So it's a uniform size on the X and Z directions. The next step I want is to move my cube on top of my grid. So if we go back to the front view, you can see it's below this line right here. I want it to be on top of that line. So what I can do then is manually move it upwards 0.65. Now that will be on top of my grid. What I don't like about this option is that if I make a change to the size of my cube, then I have to make that change to that center point each time. So rather than having it manually go back and forth, I'm going to do a procedural stuff. And that is to right click on my size Y copy parameter, add that as a paste relative reference in my center Y channel. I'm going to multiply that by 0.5. So what you'll see now is that if I make a change to the size, it will stay on top of that grid, which is exactly what I want. Now, what we want to do next is to create the points where we want our boxes to be at. So what we can do is to create a bound from the baluster. Let's call it the carved part of the model. And if I activate that, we now have this cube. I want the top primitive, sorry, that was the bottom, but the top and bottom primitive to be isolated. So I want to remove everything else. And I can do that by grouping the top primitive and the bottom primitive in their own group selections. So let's call this one top prim. I want it to be primitives. What I want to use is something called the keep binormals. I want it to look for the Y normals. Then I'm going to lower the angle. I'm actually going to put it to 0, which gives me this result. So I'm going to have the top, but no other primitive. I'm going to duplicate this group by holding out Alt and dragging. The second group, we're going to call it bottom prim. And the only thing we're going to change is instead of positive Y direction, we're going to do negative Y direction. So we're going to see that we now have the normals that are pointing downwards selected. Next, let's use a blast. I'm going to zoom out a bit. We're going to need 2 blasts. And on the first blast, I'm going to choose the top primitive. And if I view the result, you can see that the top primitive is gone. So we don't want that. We want the inverse of that. So let's do delete non-selected. And now we have top prim. And let's do the same thing for the bottom prim. That was the top prim. So let's remove that. We want the bottom prim. We want to be delete non-selected. And now we have the bottom prim. Next step is to use the fuse. What we're going to do is we're going to take all the 4 points we now have and just merge them together in the center of this primitive. So we're going to max out the snap distance of that fuse. And the first thing you notice is there's nothing there anymore. If I activate my point overlay, it's all gone. And the reason is there is this option that removes repeated vertices. Let's just deactivate that and we should have our points back. Let's move this over to the other side. And I can see I have a bottom prim. And these 2 points are going to be connected to their own copy to points. So let's add 2 copy to points. We're going to be connected to the second input. And the box we created earlier is going to be connected to the first input. And we'll merge these 2 results, selecting both copy to points, hold down Alt and dragging from the output, releasing left click button. And with that, we now have a merge. we do have one problem, and that is the bottom block is not in its correct position. And that is simply because, let's see if I can show you this quickly. So if we look at where the point of our bottom block is, it's on top. It's just below the baluster, which is fine, but we want the block to be below that. So what we can do is add a transform just before it's connected to the copied 2 points. And then we can rotate that block. You can do it in either in X or Z. I'm going to do it in X, so do 180 degrees, and that flips the box in its correct position. We're not done with the blocks though, so let's add a poly bubble again. Same process as what we did with the baluster. We don't want sharp edges, we want rounded edges. So we're going to add a poly bubble, or you can copy the one we used on the baluster. Same thing as before. We're going to ignore flat edges. We're going to add it to 60 degrees. Let's try the same distance. I think it was 0.02. We're going to add divisions. I'm going to go with 4 again. There we go. And let's move back to the perspective view. And if we zoom in, you can now see that I have more geometry. The hotkeys to unhide and hide your wireframe like this is Shift W. So you can see I can flip back and forth. You can turn points off. With that, I think we're done with the geometries. So let's add them together. I'm going to select both poly bubbles. Same as before, hold down Alt, drag from one of the outputs to create a merge. We're also going to add a null. I'm going to call the null node out baluster. And that's it. We've created a detailed baluster using a curve, the revolve node, and a few other techniques that I've shown you. So if you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe. Please add some comments in the comments section. Feedback is always appreciated. And I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.